Hey guys, I know I haven't been posting on YouTube a whole lot lately. I'd be lying if I said I hadn't burned out a little bit on the whole YouTube thing after I was doing a video every single day. But I've also got a lot going on in my life lately, and one of the things I've been busy with is writing my second novel, Wrath of Torrak. And so this is an excerpt of chapter 1 from this book here, or whatever chapter we're on at this point. And I hope you guys enjoy it. And if you do and you want more, go ahead and jump over to Amazon so that you can get your copy so you can continue reading. I'll probably only do about 10 chapters for this read through, just like I did with the other book, but this is the first book of a trilogy, so it's possible that I may do the whole book as read-throughs. That way, maybe you guys will be interested in getting the next one. I don't know, but definitely go and check it out, and I hope you guys enjoy this introduction to the novel.
Wrath of Torrak by Austin Buffington. Chapter 1. Everything I see is rotten. The trees and brush are decayed, the ground scarred. The air smells of death. I have tracked this beast for days to the Ashen Highlands. No man has dared to venture to this desolate, corrupted land for eons. But I am no mere man. I am Torrak of the Kasadinians, the mighty warrior whose name is known in many lands. There is no land too dangerous for I, no beast or man too powerful for the sting of my blade. Torrak's prideful monologue echoed in his mind as he pressed forward, his leather boots sinking into the singed and dusty ground, the immense weight of his muscular form coming down with each step. The impressions he made in the ground as he walked paled in comparison to the enormous tracks left by the hulking reptilian beast he was trailing, a terrifying creature with legs like tree trunks, teeth like daggers, and a tail that could split the earth with its force. The Balthraek. This horrific monstrosity had taken the lives of dozens of men who dared face it when it would grow overwhelmed with hunger and come down from the Ashen Highlands in search of its next meal. Few of the brave souls who confronted the Balthraek desperately trying to protect their women and children survived to tell the tale. The ones who did never returned as whole men. Torrak would be the exception. Gripping the hilt of the blade of Malwrath, Torrak followed the creature's trail up a rugged slope that filled his massive thighs with the burning sensation he lived for. The sword he carried had its own infamous history. It had drawn the blood of hundreds before falling into Torrak's possession nearly a decade before this very moment. Malwrath was a ruthless warlord from the Kasadinian Clan, a tribe from a distant land that had come to Iridun in search of treasures and slaves. The mighty warriors of Torrak's tribe did not stand by idly as their camps were ransacked by the Voracons. War ensued and many were slain on both sides, but the fighting did not come to an end until Torrak himself defeated Malwrath and took the warlord's weapon as his own. The sword was unlike any other. It was so heavy that only the strongest of men could wield it effectively. Its blade was wide and durable, made of a strong metal unknown to the Kasadinians, and seemed to never dull. Upon reaching the top of the incline, Torrak peered over the ridge and gazed upon the caldera behind it. The depression was littered with bones of various creatures, many of them undoubtedly human. Curled up and resting in the center of the caldera was the enormous lizard-like creature, the reason Torrak had come to this wretched place. It is sleeping, Torrak thought as he took in the sight, but it will surely smell me as I approach. A true challenge. Torrak's heart hammered with anticipation as he marveled at the size of the beast, each beat a drum of war. His muscles tensed, the weight of the sword heavy in his grip. Without another moment of consideration, Torrak crested the ridge and was charging down the caldera, roaring with adrenaline. The beast's form loomed before him, uncurling as it awoke to the sound of his advancing fury. As it rose to its titanic feet, the Balthraek lifted its head, which was nearly as big as Torrak's torso, and reeled back its long neck in preparation for an attack. Once Torrak reached the monstrosity, it launched its head forward, jaw snapping, but Torrak darted to the side, narrowly avoiding the reptilian's razor-sharp fangs. Torrak planted his feet into the ground, steadying himself against the gust that assaulted him from the force of the Balthraek's mighty neck. In a fluid motion, he managed to slice the creature's leg. It shrieked with pain and whipped its head around, chomping at its attacker once again. Torrak was too quick. His senses were as sharp as his blade, and he jumped backward just out of the Balthraek's reach. Then he was closing the distance again, sword outstretched before him. The blade of Malrath tasted blood as it pierced the side of the hulking lizard, but the Balthraek's flesh was tough, protecting it from a fatal wound. This primal dance continued, chomp, dodge, swipe, chomp, dodge, swipe, until the beast was losing so much blood and energy that it was struggling to hold up its enormous head. But Torrak was growing tired as well. His quickness was waning, and the strength behind his thrusts was growing weaker. Again, the Balthraek chomped at its attacker, but this time Torrak wasn't so lucky. He managed to evade enough to not lose his head, but the monster's teeth shredded through his shoulder, spilling blood down the tattooed flesh of his torso. "Arg!" Torrak shouted in rage, countering the attack with a powerful swing that sent his blade slicing through the Balthraek's neck. The earth rumbled as the beast's severed head fell before Torrak's feet, and its gargantuan frame collapsed to the ground, tail whipping through the air. Torrak dropped just in time as he felt the wind from the oncoming tail rushing at his face, the herald before the blow to come. Torrak rolled and watched the trajectory of the beast's attack. Then, realizing what was about to happen, he jumped back to his feet just as the weight of the enormous tail came crashing down onto the decayed earth, splitting a rift in the center of the caldera. Torrak began pacing backwards as the chasm stretched towards him with violent haste. Seeing that he would not be able to outrun it, he lunged to the side, but the ground escaped from beneath him and he dropped into the rift, managing to hang onto the surface with his forearms. Torrak's pulse thumped as he took a deep breath, holding on as best he could, his already tired muscles rippling as they supported his weight. The reek of iron assaulted his nostrils as he glanced to the left. The wound on his shoulder was bleeding heavily. It had been quite a long time since Torrak had suffered such a wound. The Balthraek was a worthy challenge indeed. To his left, Torrak could see that the rift was no longer spreading across the earth. The bottom of it was not far below his feet. With a sigh of relief, he let go of the chasm's lip and landed firmly on the soles of his boots. Walls of earth rose on both sides, barely higher than his head. He was lucky. Ahead of him, Torrak could make out a rectangular shape embedded within the soil at the end of the rift. He hobbled his way along the uneven ground and knelt before the shape, noticing that it was an iron chest, dusty from its time buried in the ground. Dangling from the front of the chest was a lock, crafted in the shape of a skull. A lesser man would see such a sign as a bad omen. But Torrak had been well acquainted with fear as a child, and was a slave to it no more. He placed his calloused hands on the sides of the chest and began to pull, bracing his feet into the dirt and using the powerful muscles of his thighs to rip it from its hollow. The chest was heavy, but Torrak was strong. He carried it to the other end of the rift, where a gradual slope ascended back to the surface. Once he was out of the chasm, he went for his sword and used the hilt to smash the lock apart. Sparks flew as the sword's pommel clanged against the worn lock, breaking it into pieces that clinked against the hardened dirt. Torrak lifted the lid of the chest to find a shining emerald that radiated with a sickly green hue. Somehow, the gem was both alluring and repulsive at the same time. Regardless, the warrior picked up the artifact and gazed upon it with wonder. He thought of Ira, the tribe shaman, and the woman waiting patiently for his return. Torrak had lain with many women in his 32 years, but Ira was the only one he'd ever loved. For a moment, he thought of leaving the jewel right there in the dirt, but, feeling that it would make a fine gift for his woman, he slid it into the waist of his weathered leather trousers. Blood was still spilling from Torrak's wound as he went to retrieve the Balthraek's head. a hard-earned trophy of his victory. He reached into his trousers and withdrew a long strip of leather that he'd brought just for this moment. It was thick and would hold the weight of the beast's head without snapping. He then wrapped the leather strip around the head and hefted it up onto his back, tying the strip into a knot where it crossed his torso. Then he began his journey back to camp. Torrak hobbled his way down from the Ashen Highlands, encumbered by the weight of the Balthraek's massive head. The blade of Malrath was feeling far heavier than normal as he slowly made his way down the slope, carefully finding his footing every step he took. Normally, carrying such a weight would not be a challenge for Torrak, but it seemed the battle with the beast had taken more out of him than he realized. He was growing increasingly fatigued. The bleeding from his wound had slowed, but the pain he felt after the adrenaline had worn off was far greater than what he was used to. Did the creature's fangs contain venom? He questioned as he winced from the throbbing in his shoulder. I have not heard of a venomous Balthraek. Regardless, he pushed on down the slope, knowing that the journey back to camp would be far shorter than the slow process of tracking the beast to its den. The promise of a feast and celebration motivated him more than the discouragement of his weakening state. Torrak kept pressing on, one foot then the other, falling into a continuous rhythm that prompted his mind to slip into imagination. He imagined the festivities that the evening would hold if he managed to return within the day, the tender love of Ira that waited for him back in the tent they shared, the look on her face when he presented her with the emerald he'd found. Yes, the journey to the Ashen Highlands had taken days, but only because the Balthraek's trail had detoured many times. With the incentive promised by his imagination, surely he could make his return just after nightfall, and then the fires would be ablaze and the revelry would commence. By the time the great star had risen directly above Torrak's head, he was reaching the bottom of the slope where the ground began to level out. This was a significant relief, as his thighs ached far more than usual from carrying the Balthraek's head down the hills. The now level ground was like a gift from the gods when he needed it most. The rest of the way back would be a mostly even path through the forests and prairies that led to camp. Torrak took in the sight of the trees at the bottom of the hill, dense with foliage, unlike the withered, rotting trunks that lined the Ashen Highlands. As he walked between them, he would occasionally start coughing subtly. It wasn't much and didn't hinder his travel, but it was odd nonetheless. It was not common for Torrak to get sick, but he felt as though he was coming down with an ailment. Time passed and Torrak had cleared the forest, now making his way through the open prairie beyond. This should have been the easiest part of the journey, but it was proving to be the most difficult. The weight of all he was carrying was pressing down on him in a way he was not accustomed to. The sword in his hand felt so heavy that he'd hardly be able to swing it effectively if it was needed, but that, he decided, was because he was carrying it in his left hand. Surely the shoulder wound had something to do with it. The Balthraek's head was becoming quite the burden, causing him to consider even leaving it to make the trip easier. But that was something he simply could not do. The spirits of his tribe would be elevated at the sight of the vanquished monster. He owed it to them to bring the head to camp. He even felt the weight of the small emerald in his trousers, something that waned so little he shouldn't notice at all. The sun beat down on him heavily at this point, without the shade provided by the forest. Sweat trickled its way down his face and torso, creating itchy sensations that he opted to ignore. The motivation of the evening's activities was no longer holding his attention, making the journey tedious and boring. This caused Torrak to notice such small things as the prairie creatures running as soon as he came close to them. They ran in an almost unnatural way, as if running for their lives. This would be understandable as the hulking barbarian was marching his way through their home, carrying the giant severed head of a beast. Yet, something about it felt off to him. He also noticed how every couple of yards a wildflower would lose a petal or two just as he walked past them. As the sun began its descent, only about a third of the distance to camp remained, but Torrak was starting to feel dizzy. His coughing had gotten a bit worse, now becoming a greater inconvenience, and every so often he would get a bit lightheaded. Still, he persevered. Having to spend the night in the prairie was not what he had planned, and it would be a shame as he was so close to camp. By this point, he was truly fatigued, and his muscles were beginning to give out, forcing him to unstrap the Balthraek head from his body so he could take a short rest to recuperate. As he gazed into the dead eyes of the monster he'd just vanquished, a feeling of defeat overcame him. He had slain the creature, and yet here it was nearly getting its revenge. Feeling an itch at his hip that he could no longer disregard, Torrak pulled the mysterious jewel from his trousers and scratched the spot it was resting along. As he did so, the pulsing green aura of the artifact captivated his attention, pulling his gaze away from the Balthraek head. Torrak coughed hard, spitting up phlegm that was lodged in his throat. He was beginning to have doubts about Ira appreciating the gift. It resonated with such an uncanny essence that it was hard to imagine her delighting in the object. But it was the usual routine that Torrak would bring something nice from his adventures back to his beloved, and he didn't want to let her down. He began thinking of Ira's beautiful face lighting up every time he'd return to her bearing gifts, and this image filled him with a second wind that he was certain would get him through the remainder of the journey. Torrak replaced the emerald in his trousers, fastened the Balthraek head to his back once again, and scooped his sword off the ground. With renewed vigor, he continued on his way, eventually reaching a crude path that led from the prairie to his camp, the home stretch. When the sun had made its retreat and was replaced by a bright full moon, Torrak could finally make out the fires of camp in the distance. A flickering aura of warm orange light encircled the camp that invited him home. He pressed ahead with enthusiasm, ignoring the fact that his muscles were nearly about to give out completely. This last chunk of the journey had been filled with fits of coughing and dizziness that were becoming almost unbearable, but he would not let his motivation wane. Once Torrak was within the light that emanated from camp, the people of the tribe began running his way to greet him. Children shouted with joy, women rejoiced, and men hollered jests of camaraderie as they approached. But Torrak could hear none of it, not even when one of the women cried out, shouting that something was wrong with him. His dizziness had reached its peak, and his head was throbbing with pain, exacerbated by every violent cough that left his mouth. Just as the children, who were running the fastest, reached him, Torrak collapsed to the ground under the weight of the mighty Balthraek's head. Then he fell into the black oblivion of unconsciousness.